The historical reliability of the Gospels refers to the reliability and historic character of the 4 New Testament Gospels as historical documents. Although some claim that all 4 canonical Gospels meet the 5 criteria for historical reliability, others say that little in the Gospels is considered to be historically reliable. Almost all scholars of antiquity agree that Jesus existed, but scholars differ on the historicity of specific episodes described in the biblical accounts of Jesus, and the only 2 events subject to almost universal assent are that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist and was crucified by the order of the Roman Prefect Pontius Pilate.Elements, whose historical authenticity is disputed, include the 2 accounts of the Nativity of Jesus, the miraculous events including the resurrection, and certain details about the crucifixion. According to the majority viewpoint, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, collectively referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, are the primary sources of historical information about Jesus and of the religious movement he founded. The 4th Gospel, the Gospel of John, differs greatly from the first 3 Gospels. Historians often study the historical reliability of the Acts of the Apostles when studying the reliability of the Gospels, as Acts was seemingly written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. Historians subject the Gospels to critical analysis, attempting to differentiate rather authentic, reliable information from possible inventions, exaggerations, and alterations. Since there are more textual variants in the New Testament than it has letters, scholars use textual criticism to determine which gospel variants could theoretically be taken as original. To answer this question, scholars have to ask who wrote the Gospels, when they wrote them, what was their objective in writing them, what sources the authors used, how reliable these sources were, and how far removed in time the sources were from the stories they narrate, or if they were altered later. Scholars can also look into the internal evidence of the documents to see if, for example, the document is misquoting texts from the Hebrew Tanakh, is making claims about geography that were incorrect, if the author appears to be hiding information, or if the author has made up a certain prophecy. Finally, scholars turn to external sources, including the testimony of early church leaders, writers outside the church who would have been more likely to have criticized the early churches, and to archaeological evidence. Methodology. When judging the historical reliability of the Gospels, scholars ask if the accounts in the Gospels are, when judged using normal standards that historians use on other ancient writings, reliable or not. The main issues are what are the original Gospels, whether the original Gospel works were accurate eyewitness accounts, and whether those original versions have been transmitted accurately through the ages to us. In evaluating the historical reliability of the Gospels, scholars consider a number of factors. These include authorship and date of composition, intention and genre, Gospel sources and oral tradition, textual criticism, and historical authenticity of specific sayings and narrative events. The genre of the Gospels is essential in understanding the intentions of the authors regarding the historical value of the texts. New Testament scholar Graham Stanton states that the Gospels are now widely considered to be a subset of the broad ancient literary genre of biographies. Charles H. Talbot agrees that the Gospels should be grouped with the Greco-Roman biographies, but adds that such biographies included an element of mythology, and that the Synoptic Gospels also included elements of mythology. E. P. Sanders states that these Gospels were written with the intention of glorifying Jesus and are not strictly biographical in nature. Quote, Ingrid Meisch and Anton Votel, writing for Karl Rahner in his Encyclopedia of Theological Terms, indicate that the Gospels were written primarily as theological, not historical items. Erasmo Levi-Merikakis notes that we must conclude, then, that the genre of the Gospel is not that of pure history, but neither is it that of myth, fairy tale, or legend. In fact, Gospel constitutes a genre all its own, a surprising novelty in the literature of the ancient world. Quote, some critics have maintained that Christianity is not founded on a historical figure, but rather on a mythical creation. This view proposes that the idea of Jesus was the Jewish manifestation of a pan-Hellenic cult, known as Osiris Dionysus, which acknowledged the non-historic nature of the figure, using it instead as a teaching device. Scholars tend to consider Luke's works to be closer in genre to pure history, although they also note that this is not to say that he was always reliably informed, or that, any more than modern historians, he always presented a severely factual account of events. Quote, New Testament scholar James D. G. Dunn believes that the earliest traditions within the Christian churches preserve as more than innovators, seeking to transmit, retell, explain, interpret, elaborate, but not create de novo. Through the main body of the synoptic tradition, I believe, we have in most cases direct access to the teaching and ministry of Jesus as it was remembered from the beginning of the transmission process, and so fairly direct access to the ministry and teaching of Jesus through the eyes and ears of those who went about with him. Nevertheless, David Jenkins, a former Anglican bishop of Durham and university professor, has stated that, certainly not, there is absolutely no certainty in the New Testament about anything of importance. Critical scholars have developed a number of criteria to evaluate the probability, or historical authenticity, of an attested event or saying represented in the Gospels. These criteria are applied to the Gospels in order to help scholars in reconstructions of the historical Jesus. The criterion of dissimilarity argues that if a saying or action is dissimilar to, or contrary to, the views of Judaism in the context of Jesus or the views of the early church, then it can more confidently be regarded as an authentic saying or action of Jesus. One commonly cited example of this is Jesus's controversial reinterpretation of the Mosaic Law in his Sermon on the Mount, or Peter's decision to allow uncircumcised Gentiles into what was, at the time, a sect of Judaism. The criterion of embarrassment holds that the authors of the Gospels had no reason to invent embarrassing incidents such as the denial of Jesus by Peter, or the fleeing of Jesus's followers after his arrest, and therefore such details would likely not have been included unless they were true. Bartemin, using the criterion of dissimilarity to judge the historical reliability of the claim Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, notes that it is hard to imagine a Christian inventing the story of Jesus's baptism, since this could be taken to mean that he was John's subordinate. The criterion of multiple attestation says that when two or more independent sources present similar consistent accounts, it is more likely that the accounts are accurate reports of events, so that they are reporting a tradition which predates the sources themselves. This is often used to note that the four Gospels attest to most of the same events, but that Paul's epistles often attest to these events as well, as do the writings of the early church, and to a limited degree non-Christian ancient writings. The criterion of cultural and historical congruency says that a source is less credible if the account contradicts known historical facts, or if it conflicts with cultural practices common in the period in question. It is therefore more credible if it agrees with those known facts. For example, this is often used when assessing the reliability of claims in Luke Acts, such as the official title of Pontius Pilate. Through linguistic criteria, a number of conclusions can be drawn. The criterion of Aramaisms, as it is often referred, holds that if a saying of Jesus has Aramaic roots, reflecting Jesus's Palestinian context, the saying is more likely to be authentic. Earliest extant manuscripts. The earliest manuscript is a business card-sized fragment from the Gospel of John, Ryland's Library Papyrus P52, which dates to the first half of the 2nd century. The first complete copies of single New Testament books appear around 200, and the earliest complete copy of the New Testament, the Codex Sinaiticus, dates to the 4th century. In the case of the Gospels, the gap of time between authorship and the earliest extant or existing manuscript text is less than other accepted ancient manuscripts, such as the manuscripts attributed to Plato. The earlier existing copy of Plato's Dialogues dates about 1,000 years after Plato wrote the text. The following table lists the earliest extant Gospel manuscripts. According to Martha Howell and Walter Pravenia, the conditions from which any source is produced is important, but such knowledge does not necessarily impact the reliability, or lack of reliability, of a source. Authorship and date. Most scholars hold to the two-source hypothesis, which claims that the Gospel of Mark was written first. According to the hypothesis, the authors of the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke then used the Gospel of Mark and a hypothetical Q document, in addition to some other sources, to write their individual Gospels. Scholars agree that the Gospel of John was written last, by using a different tradition and body of testimony. In addition, most scholars agree that the author of Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. Scholars hold that these books constituted two halves of a single work, Luke Acts. Strictly speaking, each Gospel is anonymous. The Gospel of John is somewhat of an exception, although the author simply refers to himself as the disciple Jesus loved, and claims to be a member of Jesus's inner circle. During the following centuries, each canonical Gospel was attributed to an apostle or to the close associate of an apostle. Synoptic Gospels. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels because of a similar sequence and wording. They are also composed in Con-Greek, and the majority of Mark and roughly half of Matthew and Luke coincide in content, in much the same sequence, often nearly verbatim. The Synoptic Gospels are the primary sources of historical information about Jesus and of the religious movement he founded. They recount the life, ministry, crucifixion and resurrection of a Jew named Jesus who spoke Aramaic. There are different hypotheses regarding the origin of the texts because the Gospels of the New Testament were written in Greek for Greek-speaking communities, that were later translated into Syriac, Latin and Coptic. Mark is the primary source for information about Jesus. It was possibly composed in Rome or Antioch in southern Syria. New Testament scholars generally credit its account of Jesus as a Galilean holy man, including his baptism by John the Baptist, his reputation as an exorcist and healer, his preaching about the coming kingdom of God, his band of close disciples, the disruption he caused at the temple, his betrayal, and his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. In 1901, William Reed challenged the historical reliability of the Gospel, concluding especially that Mark portrays Jesus as secretive about his messianic identity because the historical Jesus had never claimed to be the Messiah. Form criticism later revealed that the narrative comprises fragments put in order by Mark, or by someone before him, while the majority of scholars consider Jesus to have been an apocalyptic prophet, as he appears in Mark. A minority of prominent contemporary scholars argue that his coming kingdom was to be a social revolution rather than a supernatural apocalypse. Tradition holds that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark the Evangelist as St. Peter's interpreter. Numerous early sources say that Mark's material was dictated to him by St. Peter, who later compiled it into his Gospel. The Gospel, however, appears to rely on several underlying sources, which vary in form and in theology, and which tell against the story that the Gospel was based on Peter's preaching. Most scholars believe that Mark was written by a second-generation Christian, around or shortly after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple in year 70. Richard Bauckham has noted that the geography in Mark is accurate when looked at from the perspective of fishermen from Capernaum, which is consistent with Mark relaying the Gospel from Peter, who indeed was a fisherman. Many scholars use modern maps to gauge Mark, which often results in errors in judging Mark's geography. A fisherman would not have had a modern map in mind, but instead a mental map based on their experiential world as fishermen. According to some, Mark's geography was not always accurate. For example, Mark chapter 7 verse 31, describing Jesus going from Tyre to the Sea of Galilee by way of Sidon. The author of Mark did not seem to know that one would not go through Sidon to go from Tyre to the Sea of Galilee, and there was no road from Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the 1st century, only one from Tyre. Catholic scholars have interpreted this passage as non-problematic, since Jesus would have traveled in a wide circle, first north, then east and south. Matthew was most likely written at Antioch, then part of Roman Syria or in northern Palestine. Most scholars hold that Matthew drew heavily on Mark and added teaching from the Q document, while Matthew arranged this material into compilations, such as the Sermon on the Mount. Much of the material goes back to the historical Jesus. According to E.P. Sanders, the infancy narrative is an invention. Matthew presents Jesus' ministry as limited to the Jews, though the resurrected Jesus later commissions the disciples to preach to all the world. Geza Vermes judges that the ministry of Jesus was exclusively for Jews and that the order to proclaim the gospel to all nations was an early Christian development. According to the majority viewpoint, this gospel is unlikely to have been written by an eyewitness. While Papias reported that Matthew had written the Logia, this can hardly be a reference to the Gospel of Matthew. The author was probably a Jewish Christian writing for other Jewish Christians. Biblical scholars generally hold that Matthew was composed between the years c. 70 and 100. Based upon internal evidence, Harrington claims parts of the Gospel of Matthew may have first been written in Aramaic. The birth stories and the resurrection experiences, on the other hand, were composed in Con Greek. The Ebionim seem to have worked from a version of Matthew in Aramaic that excluded birth and post-resurrection stories. Luke was written in a large city west of Palestine, although Burton Mack, on the basis of its colloquial Greek and clear Pauline connections, and its later acceptance by the heretical Marcionites, suggests an author from Greece or Western Asia Minor. Like Matthew, Luke drew on Mark and added material from Q. Luke also includes a large amount of unique material, such as the parable of the Good Samaritan, and many of these parables seem to be authentic. Luke emphasizes the universal nature of Jesus' mission and message. Geza Vermes concludes that this theme is not authentic to the historical Jesus. As is the case with Matthew, much controversy has surrounded the Lucan birth narrative. Some scholars uphold the traditional claim that Luke the Evangelist, an associate of St. Paul, who was probably not an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, wrote the Gospel of Luke and Acts of the Apostles. Others point out that Acts contradicts Paul's own letters and denies him the important title of apostle, suggesting that the author was not a companion of Paul's. As is the case with all the Gospels, it is unknown exactly when the Gospel of Luke was written. Scholars have proposed a range of dates from as early as 60 AD to as late as 90 AD. Donald Guthrie argues, however, that Acts was written in the early 60s AD, and therefore the Gospel of Luke would have to have been written prior to that, around AD 60. It is generally agreed that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles were both written by the same author. The most direct evidence comes from the prefaces of each book. Both prefaces were addressed to Theophilus, and Acts of the Apostles says in reference to the Gospel of Luke, "In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen." Furthermore, there are linguistic and theological similarities between the two works, suggesting that they have a common author. Both books also contain common interests. John was likely composed at Ephesus, although other possibilities are Antioch, northern Syria, Palestine and Alexandria. Some scholars believe that Jesus' teaching in this gospel cannot be reconciled with that found in the Synoptics, whilst others, including John A. T. Robinson, hold the view that the Synoptics are best reconciled within the framework of John. In the majority viewpoint, it is unlikely that John the Apostle read the Gospel of John. Rather than a plain account of Jesus' ministry, the Gospel is a deeply mediated representation of Jesus' character and teachings, making direct apostolic authorship unlikely. Opinion, however, is widely divided on this issue and there is no widespread consensus. Many scholars believe that the beloved disciple is a person who heard and followed Jesus, and the Gospel of John is based heavily on the witness of this beloved disciple. Most scholars date the Gospel of John to c. 80 to 95. Textual criticism and interpolations. Textual criticism deals with the identification and removal of transcription errors in the texts of manuscripts. Ancient scribes made errors or alterations in attempting to determine the original text of the New Testament books. Some modern textual critics have identified sections as additions of material centuries after the Gospel was written. These are called interpolations. In modern translations of the Bible, the results of textual criticism have led to certain verses, words and phrases being left out or marked as not original. For example, there are a number of Bible verses in the New Testament that are present in the King James Version but are absent from most modern Bible translations. Most modern textual scholars consider these verses interpolations. The verse numbers have been reserved, but without any text, so as to preserve the traditional numbering of the remaining verses. The biblical scholar Bart D. Ehrman notes that many current verses were not part of the original text of the New Testament. These scribal additions are often found in late medieval manuscripts of the New Testament, but not in the manuscripts of the earlier centuries. He adds, and because the King James Bible is based on later manuscripts, such verses became part of the Bible tradition in English-speaking lands. Quote, he notes, however, that modern English translations, such as the New International Version, were written by using a more appropriate textual method. Most modern Bibles have footnotes to indicate passages that have disputed source documents. Bible commentaries also discuss these, sometimes in great detail. While many variations have been discovered between early copies of biblical texts, most of these are variations in spelling, punctuation, or grammar. Also, many of these variants are so particular to the Greek language that they would not appear in translation. translations into other languages. Two of the most important interpolations of the last verses of the Gospel of Mark and the story of the adulterous woman in the Gospel of John. Some critics also believe the explicit reference to the Trinity in 1 John to have been a later addition. The New Testament has been preserved in more than 5,800 fragmentary Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts and 9,300 manuscripts in various other ancient languages including Syriac, Slavic, Ethiopic and Armenian. Not all biblical manuscripts come from Orthodox Christian writers. For example, the Gnostic writings of Valentinus come from the 2nd century AD, and these Christians were regarded as heretics by the mainstream church. The sheer number of witnesses presents unique difficulties, although it gives scholars a better idea of how close modern Bibles are to the original versions. Bruce Metzger says the more often you have copies that agree with each other, especially if they emerge from different geographical areas, the more you can cross-check them to figure out what the original document was like. The only way they'd agree would be where they went back genealogically in a family tree that represents the descent of the manuscripts. In the text of the New Testament, Kurt Orland and Barbara Orland compare the total number of variant-free verses, and the number of variants per page, among the 7 major editions of the Greek NT, concluding 62.9%, or 4,999 7,947th agreement. They concluded thus in nearly 2/3 of the New Testament text. The 7 editions of the Greek New Testament which we have reviewed are in complete accord, with no differences other than in orthographical details. Verses in which any one of the 7 editions differs by a single word are not counted. In the Gospels, Acts, and Revelation the agreement is less, while in the letters it is much greater. Per Orland and Orland, the total consistency achieved in the Gospel of Matthew was 60%, the total consistency achieved in the Gospel of Mark was 45%, the total consistency achieved in the Gospel of Luke was 57%, and the total consistency achieved in the Gospel of John was 52%. Almost all of these variants are minor, and most of them are spelling or grammatical errors. Almost all can be explained by some type of unintentional scribal mistake, such as poor eyesight. Very few variants are contested among scholars, and few or none of the contested variants carry any theological significance. Modern biblical translations reflect this scholarly consensus where the variants exist, while the disputed variants are typically noted as such in the translations. A quantitative study on the stability of the New Testament compared early manuscripts to later manuscripts, up to the Middle Ages, with the Byzantine manuscripts, indicated that the text had more than 90% stability over this time period. It has been estimated that only 0.1% to 0.2% of the New Testament variants impact the meaning of the text in any significant fashion.